The rain hammered against the window of the Greyhound bus as it pulled away from Port Authority Terminal in Manhattan. Julia pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. She clutched a small backpack on her lap, everything she owned reduced to a few pieces of clothing, some toiletries, and a worn notebook filled with memories she wished she could forget. The bus smelled of stale coffee and damp fabric, and the engine's low rumble vibrated through the seat beneath her. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past 3 years begin to lift, if only slightly. New York had been her prison, not in the literal sense, but in the way it trapped her between expectations and disappointments. Her family, once proud members of Manhattan's elite social circles, had dictated every step of her life. Private schools, charity galas, curated friendships with the children of other wealthy families. Julia had learned early that her value was measured not by who she was, but by how well she performed the role assigned to her. When she dared to pursue art instead of law, her mother's silence became louder than any argument. When she fell in love with a musician who lived in Brooklyn, her father simply erased her trust fund as if deleting a line of text. The breaking point came 3 months ago. Julia had been standing in the marble foyer of her family's Upper East Side townhouse, dressed in a gown chosen by her mother, preparing to attend yet another fundraiser where she would smile and nod and pretend she belonged. Her younger sister, Claire, had looked at her with something close to pity and whispered, "You don't have to keep doing this." That night, Julia walked out. She spent weeks sleeping on friends' couches, taking shifts at a coffee shop in Williamsburg, saving every dollar until she had enough for this bus ticket heading west. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed distance. The bus would take her to Chicago first, then she would decide, maybe further west to Denver or south to Texas. Geography felt like freedom, and every mile between her and Manhattan was a small victory. She opened her notebook and stared at a charcoal sketch she had made weeks earlier, a self-portrait that looked more like a ghost than a person. She closed the book quickly and shoved it back into her bag. Across the aisle, a young mother rocked a crying infant, singing softly in Spanish. An elderly man, in a worn flannel shirt, read a paperback novel under the dim overhead light. Julia envied their simplicity, their lack of entanglement with the kind of world she was fleeing. She wondered if she would ever feel normal again, if the weight of her family's judgment would ever truly leave her. What Julia did not know was that, back in New York, someone else was making plans to find her. Andrew Hastings sat in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, staring at his laptop screen. He had spent the last 2 hours piecing together information from mutual friends, social media posts that Julia had forgotten to delete, and a single text message she had sent him a week ago that simply read, "I need to disappear for a while. Please don't look for me." He had typed and deleted a dozen responses before deciding that words were not enough. Andrew was not a duke anymore, not in any official sense. He had been born into British aristocracy, the second son of a family with a title that stretched back centuries. But 5 years ago, he had walked away from it all. The breaking point for him had been watching his older brother manipulate their aging father into disinheriting their sister over a minor scandal. Andrew had stood up for her, and in doing so, had lost his place in the family. He moved to New York with nothing but his name and a determination to live differently. He worked as a consultant for nonprofits, helping organizations navigate complex funding structures. It was honest work, and it paid enough for a small apartment in Bed-Stuy and occasional dinners out. He had met Julia 2 years ago at a gallery opening in Chelsea. She had been standing in front of a painting, staring at it with an intensity that made him curious. They started talking, and within an hour, he felt like he had known her for years. They became friends, meeting for coffee or walks through Prospect Park, sharing stories about their families and the ways they had both been suffocated by expectation. Andrew had never told Julia that he used to be part of the British aristocracy. He introduced himself simply as Andrew, and she never asked for more. When Julia disappeared, Andrew felt a pull he could not ignore. He knew what it was like to run, but he also knew that running alone could be dangerous. He booked a ticket on the same bus line, guessing she would head west. He packed a small duffel bag, locked his apartment, and left a note for his landlord saying he would be gone for a few weeks. He did not have a plan beyond finding her and making sure she was safe. He did not want to bring her back or convince her to reconcile with her family. He simply wanted her to know she was not alone. The bus rolled through the night, passing through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. Julia fell asleep with her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass. In her dreams, she was running through an endless hallway, doors slamming shut behind her, her mother's voice echoing from somewhere she could not see. She woke with a start as the bus pulled into a rest stop outside Harrisburg. The fluorescent lights of the gas station glowed harsh and artificial in the darkness. A few passengers shuffled off to stretch their legs and buy snacks. Julia stayed on the bus, pulling her hood over her head. She watched a family pile out of an SUV, two children laughing and chasing each other around the parking lot while their parents unloaded bags from the trunk. She felt a pang of something she could not name. Envy, maybe, or grief for the childhood she never had. When the bus started moving again, Julia opened her notebook and began to sketch. She drew the rain-streaked window, the sleeping man across the aisle, the mother still rocking her baby. Drawing had always been her way of making sense of the world, of capturing moments that felt too fleeting to hold on to otherwise. She did not notice when the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange as they crossed into Ohio. She did not notice the way the landscape changed from dense forests to flat farmland, silos and barns appearing like sentries along the highway. By the time the bus pulled into Chicago, Julia had filled 3 pages with sketches. She stepped off the bus into the cold morning air, her breath visible in clouds. Union Station loomed above her, grand and imposing, and for a moment she felt small and insignificant. But she also felt free. She bought a ticket for the next bus, heading to a small town in Illinois she had never heard of before. It was called Elmwood, population 3,000. It seemed like the kind of place where no one would ask questions. Andrew arrived in Chicago 6 hours later. He stood in the same spot where Julia had stood, looking up at the station with a mixture of determination and doubt. He asked the ticket counter if they remembered selling a ticket to a young woman with dark hair and a backpack. The clerk shrugged. Hundreds of people passed through every day. Andrew bought a ticket west and hoped he was guessing right. He did not know that Julia was already in Elmwood, walking down a quiet main street lined with brick buildings and mom-and-pop stores, looking for a place to start over. Elmwood, Illinois, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. Julia walked into the town's only cafe, a place called Rosie's, with its faded red awning and hand-painted sign hanging above the door. The interior smelled like cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee, and a bell above the door chimed as she entered. A woman in her 50s looked up from behind the counter, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She had graying hair pulled into a loose bun and a face that seemed kind but wary. Julia approached the counter and cleared her throat. She had rehearsed this moment on the bus, but now her voice felt small and uncertain. She asked if they were hiring. The woman, who introduced herself as Rosie, looked Julia up and down, taking in the worn sneakers, the backpack slung over one shoulder, the exhaustion in her eyes. Rosie did not ask where Julia had come from or why she was there. She simply nodded and said they could use an extra pair of hands during the morning rush. Julia started the next day. The work was simple but grounding. She took orders, poured coffee, wiped down tables, and learned the rhythms of the cafe. The regulars came in at the same time every day. Mr. Henderson, a retired teacher, ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin and sat by the window reading the newspaper. Mrs. Carter brought her knitting and chatted with Rosie about town gossip. A group of construction workers came in around 6:30, ordering breakfast sandwiches and joking loudly before heading to the job site. Julia kept her head down and her conversations brief. She told people her name was Julia and that she was passing through, looking for work. No one pressed for details. In a town like Elmwood, people respected privacy as much as they valued community. Julia rented a small room above the hardware store from an elderly man named Mr. Briggs, who asked for first month's rent and nothing else. The room had a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto Main Street. It was sparse, but it was hers. At night, Julia lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. The distant hum of a car passing by, the creak of the building's old wooden frame, the rustle of wind through the trees outside. She thought about her family and wondered if they were looking for her. Her mother had probably noticed her absence by now, though Julia doubted she would admit to anyone that her daughter had simply walked away. Her father would be angry, viewing her departure as another act of defiance. Claire, her sister, was the only one who might understand. Julia's mind often drifted back to the night she left. She remembered standing in the foyer, her mother's voice sharp and cold as she criticized the dress Julia was wearing, the way her hair was styled, the fact that she had not yet secured an invitation to the Met Gala. Her mother's words had felt like small cuts, each one adding to the accumulation of wounds Julia had been carrying for years. Her father had been in his study, door closed, as always. He had stopped speaking to Julia directly months earlier, communicating only through her mother or his assistant. It was easier for him to pretend she did not exist than to confront the reality that his daughter was not the person he wanted her to be. Julia had tried once to explain why she could not follow the path they had laid out for her. She had sat down with her mother over tea in the sunroom of their townhouse and talked about her passion for art, her desire to create something meaningful rather than simply exist as a decoration in someone else's life. Her mother had listened in silence, then set down her teacup and said, "Passion does not pay bills, Julia, and it certainly does not secure your future." The conversation had ended there. The memories came in fragments, sharp and disjointed. Julia remembered her 16th birthday, when her mother had thrown a lavish party at their estate in the Hamptons. Julia had spent the entire evening feeling like a performer in someone else's show, smiling for photographs, thanking guests for gifts she did not want, dancing with boys her mother had carefully vetted. She remembered sneaking away to the beach after midnight, sitting alone in the sand and watching the waves crash against the shore. She had felt more connected to the ocean than to any of the people at that party. She remembered her first serious relationship with a guy named Marcus, who played guitar in a band that performed at small venues in Brooklyn and Queens. Her parents had forbidden her from seeing him, but she had gone anyway, taking the subway after dark and slipping into crowded clubs where no one knew her name. With Marcus, she felt like she could breathe. But when her father found out, he had Marcus's band blacklisted from every venue that had connections to his network. The relationship ended, not because they stopped caring about each other, but because Julia could not bear the weight of her family's interference. In Elmwood, those memories felt both distant and painfully close. Julia worked long shifts at Rosie's, grateful for the distraction. She learned to make the cafe's signature cinnamon rolls, kneading dough until her hands ached. She memorized the orders of the regulars and began to recognize the subtle rhythms of the town. On Sundays, the cafe filled with families after church. On Fridays, Teenagers came in after school, ordering milkshakes and crowding into the corner booth. Julia found comfort in the predictability, the simplicity of knowing what each day would bring. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she arrived, a woman named Linda came into the cafe. She was in her early 40s, with auburn hair and a warm smile. Linda owned the town's bookstore, a small shop 2 doors down from Rosie's. She struck up a conversation with Julia while waiting for her coffee, asking how she was settling in. Julia gave vague answers, but Linda did not seem put off. She invited Julia to a book club that met every Thursday evening at the bookstore. Julia hesitated, then agreed. It seemed like a small, safe way to connect. The book club consisted of 5 women, all of them different ages and backgrounds. There was Linda, who led the discussions with enthusiasm. There was Margaret, a retired librarian with a sharp wit and a love for mystery novels. There was Sarah, a young mother who brought her infant daughter and balanced reading with diaper changes. There was Donna, a nurse who worked night shifts at the county hospital and always looked exhausted but showed up anyway. And there was Emily, a high school English teacher who had moved to Elmwood from Chicago and still missed the city. Julia attended her first meeting with low expectations, but she found herself drawn into the conversation. They were reading a novel about a woman who left her abusive marriage and started over in a small coastal town. The parallels to Julia's own life were not lost on her, though she did not share them. She listened as the women talked about resilience, about the courage it takes to leave behind what is familiar, even when it is harmful. She felt seen in a way she had not felt in years. After the meeting, Linda walked Julia back to her apartment. They talked about books and art, and Julia mentioned that she used to draw. Linda's eyes lit up. She said the bookstore had a small gallery space in the back that was currently empty, and she would love to feature local artists. Julia felt a flutter of something she had not felt in months. Hope, maybe, or possibility. She promised to think about it. That night, Julia opened her notebook and flipped through the sketches she had made over the past few weeks. There were drawings of the cafe, the main street of Elmwood, the faces of people she had met. She had not realized how much she had been documenting her new life. She thought about what it would mean to display her work, to make herself visible again. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Meanwhile, Andrew had been making his way west, following the faint trail Julia had left behind. He spoke to bus drivers, cafe workers, and hotel clerks, piecing together her movements. In Cleveland, he learned she had stopped for a few hours at a diner. In Indianapolis, he found a sketch she had left behind on a napkin, a drawing of a woman holding a child. The waitress remembered her and said she had asked about bus routes heading into smaller towns in Illinois. Andrew bought a map and started circling places Julia might go. When he saw Elmwood, population 3,000, nestled between farmland and forest, he had a feeling. It was the kind of place someone would go to disappear. He arrived in Elmwood on a cold, grey afternoon. The town looked like something out of a postcard, with its brick buildings and tree-lined streets. Andrew checked into the town's only motel, a modest place called the Elmwood Inn, and started asking questions. He showed a photo of Julia to the woman at the front desk, who said she looked familiar, but could not place where she had seen her. Andrew walked down Main Street, peering into shop windows, feeling both hopeful and helpless. He stopped in front of Rosie's cafe, drawn by the smell of coffee and fresh pastry. Through the window, he saw her. Julia was behind the counter, tying an apron around her waist, laughing at something Rosie had said. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. She looked different, thinner maybe and tired, but there was something lighter about her too, as if a burden had been partially lifted. He stood there for a long moment, debating whether to go inside. He had come all this way, but now that he had found her, he was not sure what to do. Andrew decided to wait. He did not want to overwhelm her or make her feel like he was trying to control her choices. He checked into the motel and spent the next few days observing from a distance. He saw Julia walking to work in the mornings, saw her chatting with customers, saw her sitting alone on a bench during her break, sketching in a notebook. He saw her attend the book club at Linda's bookstore, saw her smile when she thought no one was watching. He realized she was trying to rebuild herself piece by piece, and he did not want to disrupt that process. But he also knew he could not stay invisible forever. One evening, as a storm rolled into town, dark clouds gathering overhead and the wind picking up, Andrew made his decision. He would approach her, not as someone trying to rescue her, but as a friend offering support. He did not know how she would react, but he knew he had to try. The first drops of rain began to fall as he walked toward Rosie's cafe, his heart pounding in his chest. The storm hit Elmwood with surprising intensity. What had started as a light drizzle turned into a downpour, rain lashing against windows and turning the streets into rivers. Julia was closing up the cafe when the power went out. The overhead lights flickered once, then died, plunging the interior into darkness. Rosie had already left for the day, trusting Julia to lock up. Julia stood behind the counter, listening to the wind howl outside and the rain hammer against the roof. She lit a few candles she found in the supply closet and placed them around the cafe, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Julia resigned herself to waiting it out. She pulled a stool up to the counter and sat down, watching the rain through the front window. The street was empty, everyone having taken shelter. The only sound was the relentless drumming of rain and the occasional crack of thunder. Then the door opened, letting in a gust of wind and rain. Julia jumped, startled, and looked up to see a man standing in the doorway. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his coat dripping water onto the floor. For a moment, Julia did not recognize him. Then her breath caught. It was Andrew. She stood up so quickly the stool scraped loudly against the floor. Her heart was pounding, a mix of shock, confusion, and something else she could not name. Andrew closed the door behind him and stood there, looking at her with an expression that was both apologetic and determined. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The candles flickered between them, casting long shadows. Julia found her voice first. She asked what he was doing there, her tone sharper than she intended. Andrew took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure how close he should get. He said he had been looking for her, that he wanted to make sure she was okay. Julia felt a surge of anger. She told him she did not need him to check on her, that she had left New York for a reason, and that reason included not being found. Andrew absorbed her words without flinching. He said he understood, that he was not there to bring her back or to judge her choices. He said he just wanted her to know she was not alone, that she did not have to go through this by herself. Julia's anger faltered. She wanted to stay mad at him, to push him away. But the truth was that seeing him brought a flood of emotions she had been trying to suppress. Relief, fear, gratitude, resentment. They all tangled together, making it hard to think clearly. She asked how he had found her. Andrew explained the trail he had followed, the bus drivers and waitresses, the sketch on the napkin. He admitted it had taken him longer than he expected, but once he narrowed it down to Elmwood, he had watched from a distance, waiting for the right moment. Julia did not know whether to be touched or disturbed by his persistence. She told him he should not have come, that she was fine on her own. Andrew nodded, but he did not move toward the door. He said he believed her, but he also knew what it was like to run from the past, and he knew how lonely it could be. Julia felt her defenses crumbling. She sat back down on the stool, suddenly exhausted. Andrew pulled up another stool and sat a few feet away, giving her space. For a while, they just sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The candlelight flickered between them, creating a strange intimacy in the darkened cafe. Julia finally broke the silence. She asked why he cared so much, why he would go to all this trouble for her. Andrew looked at her steadily. He said it was because he recognized himself in her, because he knew what it was like to feel suffocated by expectations, to feel like you were living someone else's life instead of your own. Julia felt a lump in her throat. She asked if he had ever regretted leaving his family, his old life. Andrew was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. He said there were days when he missed the security, the sense of belonging, even if it was a belonging built on obligations rather than genuine connection. But he also said he had never regretted the decision itself, only the pain it caused. He said, "Choosing yourself over what others expect of you is one of the hardest things a person can do, but it is also one of the most necessary." Julia felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She had not cried since she left New York, had not allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had lost. But sitting there, in the candle-lit cafe, with Andrew across from her and the storm raging outside, the dam finally broke. She started to cry, softly at first, then harder, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. Andrew did not move toward her. He simply sat there, a steady presence, letting her release everything she had been holding in. When Julia's tears finally subsided, she felt lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted from her chest. She wiped her eyes and apologized, embarrassed. Andrew shook his head and said there was nothing to apologize for. He said sometimes you need to break down before you can start rebuilding. Julia laughed, a shaky, watery sound, and said that was one way to put it. They talked through the night as the storm slowly passed. Julia told him about her family, about the suffocating expectations and the constant feeling of never being enough. She told him about her mother's coldness, her father's silence, the way they had tried to mold her into someone she was not. Andrew listened without interrupting, his expression empathetic. When she finished, he shared his own story. He told her about growing up in a family where duty came before individuality, where every decision was measured against centuries of tradition. He told her about his older brother, who had embraced the role expected of him, and his younger sister, who had been punished for stepping out of line. He told her about the moment he decided to leave, and the loneliness that followed. Julia realized that, despite their different backgrounds, they had been shaped by the same forces. They had both been taught that their value was conditional, that love and approval had to be earned through obedience. And they had both reached a point where survival meant walking away. The storm outside had quieted to a gentle rain by the time they finished talking. The power flickered back on, the overhead lights humming to life. Julia blew out the candles and looked at Andrew in the sudden brightness. He looked tired, but relieved, as if he had been carrying a burden he was finally able to set down. Julia stood up and walked to the door, unlocking it and stepping outside. The air was cool and fresh, washed clean by the rain. The streets glistened under the streetlights, and the sky was beginning to clear, stars peeking through the thinning clouds. Andrew followed her outside, and they stood together on the sidewalk, breathing in the night air. Julia turned to him and said she was glad he had come, even though it had scared her at first. Andrew smiled and said he was glad too. They walked together through the quiet streets of Elmwood, past the darkened shops and the empty park, until they reached the hardware store where Julia was staying. She paused at the door and turned to face him. She asked where he was staying, and he told her about the motel. She nodded, then impulsively hugged him. It was brief, almost awkward, but it felt right. When she pulled back, she said they should talk more tomorrow when her head was clearer. Andrew agreed and said good night. Julia watched him walk away, disappearing into the shadows, then climbed the stairs to her room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange mix of emotions. For the first time since she had left New York, she did not feel entirely alone.